of our tragedies, of our pain, of our suffering, that matters most.
Our wounds set us on our wandering. They shape our path. They give us our wondering, the questions that we ask. They help us find our wise guides and our wisdom. And then they lead us to our work, and that we put our healing in the service of healing others.
What is ours to do is intimately entwined with what we've experienced in an embodied way, and that it isn't supposed to hurt to be of service in this world. That there is joy in bringing our gifts.
In her award-winning book, Wild Mercy, today's guest writes, "Where death touches lives, it transfigures the inner landscape. Nothing will ever be the same after someone we love has left this world. Whether they drew their last breath at 100 or never had a chance to draw their first breath at birth, our loved ones who have died seem to teach us the most about being alive." She also writes, "The way of the everyday mystic is to weave our humanness into the tapestry of our relationship with the divine. We welcome everything and expand our ability to hold what is. We bow at the feet of reality, not by turning away from what hurts, but by tenderly turning towards it. Heartbreak is the path of holiness." Mirabai Starr is an award-winning author, contemporary translator of sacred literature, international speaker, and world-renowned teacher of contemplative practice and inner spiritual dialogue. A certified bereavement counselor, Mirabai helps mourners harness the transformational power of loss. Her book, Wild Mercy, Living the Fierce and Tender Wisdom of the Women Mystics, continues to sell wildly and has been translated into multiple languages. She's the author of so many other great works, and my precious friend. This is the Healer with a Thousand Faces podcast, conversations with wise guides about how our wounds lead us to our wanderings, our wonderings, our wisdom, and our work, and how we figure out how to put our healing in the service of healing the world. In this first episode, in the first third, Mirabai and I talk about what it means to walk an interspiritual path. In the second third, after hearing about Mirabai's life from that angle, we talk about how grief becomes a part of that spiritual path and how she's experienced that. Mirabai shares about losing her brother in childhood, her high school boyfriend, suffering abuse at the hands of a false guru as a young adult, and finally, as a young mother, losing her daughter, Jenny. It's heavy and it's heartbreaking, and it's also what makes her such a voice for healing. In the bottom third of the episode, we talk about what it means to walk the healer's journey and how it shows up in the lives of so many mystics, especially women, and how it might show up in our lives as well. Welcome, friends, to the Healer with a Thousand Faces podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Mirabai, I am so thrilled, excited, and grateful that you have agreed to come and join me for this conversation today to talk about the Healer with a Thousand Faces. Thank you so much.
It's so easy to say yes to you because you're just so gracious like that. But I'm excited to see this podcast flower because I think I watch the seeds get planted, let's say, and watch them be watered by your life. And now to see the way that you're going to be feeding the world with these conversations is very exciting to me.
Oh, thank you. I so appreciate that. You have always been such a huge source of wisdom and encouragement for me, and encouragement to not be afraid to use my voice, which I think is something we all need to hear, right?
It's so true. And, I think more later in this conversation, depending on what you ask me, but because our friendship is deep and the channels that our conversations flow through are familiar to me, I think we'll get there. But yeah, I think that it's through being stripped of what we used to care about and being prioritized by trauma and tragedy
Yeah.
that the filters that we used to put on our voices come
Yeah.
flying off, and we just can't mess around anymore. It's time to tell the truth.
And it's so funny. This is not in the scripted interview, which we'll get into in a second, but I think about, especially for you as a teacher and an author who I think has so many valuable things to say, and in my experience of you is utterly devoid of self-importance and self-seriousness, which I so
Mhm.
appreciate about you. There's so much content out there, and there's a big difference between, pumping more content in the world and also trusting our inner voice leading our external voice to say what is ours to say. Do you have, like, just as the beginning, any thoughts on that, on how anyone listening can, like, trust the value of their own voice in the world?
Mm. Well, in some ways, most of us are so conditioned by dominant culture to have a shiny thing to
Mm,
present that it takes a lot of unlearning to
mm,
dismantle that impulse to make yourself look pretty
mm,
and to speak truths that are often either not they don't lift you as a primo example of a person who has all their shit together, and
mm.
b just sometimes messy when we try to speak from a place of authenticity. It doesn't always come out in ways that, yeah, that dominant culture would consider to be coherent, provable, um, even even clear.
Yeah.
And yet there is a deeper clarity that comes with truth telling, with authenticity that is truly luminous.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's so helpful. And the permission to be messy, right? That's such a gift. It's so funny. We're going to do this in a second. When I do spiritual direction with folks, a lot of times I hear this one statement over and over again. Someone always says, "I don't know where to begin," and I always
Mm.
say, "Just start in the middle," because every good story starts in the middle, right?
Spoken like a true mythologist.
Oh my God. Well, I have to tell you, in 2008, in a story that you know very well because of our friendship, I had lost my mom and I'd lost my brother in 6 months apart, and I had become sort of magnetized to John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul during that season. Some in part coincidence. I'd lost my brother in April, and in September I got a call that my mom was checking into the hospital with a migraine, which within 24 hours turned out to be a brain tumor. And so I had to jump on a bus and go, and I went with sort of the clothes on my back and the bag on my shoulder. And in that bag was John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul and Carl Jung's commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead and a journal. And that was it. And that's kind of what ended up guiding me through the month that I spent with her, making her sort of end of life medical decisions. But this fused me to John of the Cross, and parallel story to that. I remember the moment that I was walking in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I wandered into one of my favorite bookstores, and I pulled a copy of The Dark Night of the Soul by John of the Cross, translated by Mirabai Starr. And I thought, who the hell is Mirabai Starr? What a great
Mm.
name. And so then that book became a companion, and then sat in my library for the years thereafter. But you and I didn't cross paths in real life until 11 years later, when I ended up at a retreat, a spiritual retreat, I think for young influencers or something of the sort. And I ended up there very much by accident, not quite as young as everyone else, and certainly not an influencer. And you arrived on the scene as a surprise guest star, and I was so thrilled. And I ended up standing in the lunch line behind you, and I don't know if you remember this, but I leaned over and you were talking to a friend who'd come with you, and I said, "Hey, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but would you mind terribly if I ask you a really nerdy ass question?" And that's exactly the way I phrased it. And as I'm sure this happens to you all the time, you leaned over and very graciously were like, "Of course." And I think Mirabai, my question went something like, In the early 20th century, there was a Spanish priest and scholar named Miguel Asen Palacios, and he wrote a book about how John of the Cross was influenced by the Sufic tradition. And then he wrote another book about how the Sufis influenced Dante. And then he wrote another book about how the Sufis themselves were influenced by Hesychastic Eastern Orthodox Christian mystics. This was the real question. And I was like, do you know his work, and do you think there's any validity to that? And you paused and you went, that really is a nerdy ass question. which was just such a great moment. I so appreciated it. And I was like, I'm sorry, there's so few people I can actually ask that question to. And you said, no, I am one of the people that it's appropriate to ask that question to. And I think you gave me a very kind and a very gracious 2 to 5 minute answer where you basically said, probably, which was wonderful. But as crazy as it sounds, I really appreciate, one, you validating my nerdiness in that moment. And two, my background at that point was a deep roots in Christianity, which I'd painfully deconstructed, and comparative religious studies and comparative mythology. And so in talking about that, you validated in me what I've heard you refer to in yourself as being spiritually polyamorous.
Yeah.
So before we unpack all the heavy stuff that we're about to get into about the healer's journey, would you mind sharing a little bit about your love of Sufism and John of the Cross, and how that deep spiritual path that you have walking between so many traditions sort of came to be?
Mm. Well, I have to say that when you asked me that question, you were singing my song. It's a passion of mine, is finding the interwoven um, tributaries of the so-called monotheistic or Abrahamic traditions, and how they all arise from and flow back into the same kind of boundless sea of oneness, as Ram Dass said of my work, and that somehow I get to spend this life celebrating that confluence. And so finding someone else who also is excited about that was a thrill to me. So it wasn't just you were tipping your hand in that moment. It's like, oh yes, I am a companion on this way, and that's always a thrill for me. So it was a moment of great gladness for me to find you.
It was,
So
yeah, so good.
yeah, oh, thank you. So yeah, I think my interspiritual orientation was and continues to be my spiritual formation. So I wasn't ever part of a single spiritual tradition. My family was non-religious, Jewish, as many American Jews are and have been. And we can get into why that is a thing, if you want, at some point. And and so I really grew up with no religious indoctrination, but a deep curiosity and thirst for the wisdom at the depths of the wellspring of every one of them. And also, I grew up in proximity to the Lama Foundation, an interspiritual community here in the mountains of northern New Mexico, very close to where I live in Taos and where I grew up and still live, where all the world's great wisdom ways are celebrated, practiced, not just studied, but practiced. In fact, often not studied. It wasn't until I got to graduate school that I finally plunged into the more scholarly side of things. But up to that point, through my teens and early 20s, I was praying with deep prayers of every one of the major world religious traditions, anyway, including the indigenous wisdom paths.
Yeah, so rich here in New Mexico, especially, huh? The wisdom of the local pueblos and indigenous Americans. And I love that you learned by practice. I think that's not. I think most of us learn by reading something in a book or hearing something on a podcast. It's such a different way to embody those traditions. And then you said you studied comparative religions, I think, was it at UNM?
Yeah, and so that's why I feel like my answer isn't going to be that applicable because
Hmm.
it was such a weird way to, be to fall in love with God. But
Yeah.
yes, so my primary practices that came out of my time at Lama were deep devotional practices in the Hindu tradition, and
Hmm.
I gave my heart to an Indian saint named Karoli Baba at the time, and I've loved him ever since. I mean, he's no longer alive, wasn't alive then either. I developed a very simple but deeply informed Buddhist sitting practice, really from the Vipassana tradition, although I was also exposed to Zen at that time and Tibetan Buddhist wisdom, and both of those streams have woven in with my mindfulness and Vipassana type practice. And Sufism was a huge part of my time at Lama. And there are numerous Sufi paths, Sufi orders, that I connected with. The Mevlevi tradition of Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, the great mystical poet Rumi, and Dances of Universal Peace. Murshid Samuel Lewis was the developer of that tradition where he really drew. I think this is how Sufism really affected me as a teenager. Murshid Sam created the Dances of Universal Peace, which used to be called Sufi dancing, by taking sacred phrases from all the world's great religions and turning them into beautiful melodic chants and assigning very simple dance movements to them that are done in a group. So it's like this huge group prayer that is exalted and uplifting. And that was my exposure to Sufism. Later, I found out it's really the mystical expression, let's call it, of Islam. And I began to get much more into the heart of Islam. And then, my ancestral tradition of Judaism, it was at Lama, not from my parents or grandparents, that I learned about mystical Judaism or Jewish mysticism. And really, the one tradition that was left out of this whole mix was Christianity. And I think that's partly because my parents were so, as American Jews, were so allergic to and felt so oppressed by the dominant culture's emphasis on Christianity, and all the other reasons that Jewish people are suspicious of not of Christ, but of Christ's followers. As Gandhi said, I love you. I love your Christ. It's his followers I have trouble with. And I think that's how my parents were. But later I, fell deeply in love with the Christian tradition through the Christian mystics. So yes, in graduate school is where I decided I wanted to. It was my graduate degree is in philosophy, but I focused on mysticism and mystical knowing, epistemology, and that's where I really dove into to comparative religions.
That's so great. Well, and I appreciate it because I think in my own life, I started so deep in the Christian path and deconstructed that a bit. And then I work with so many folks who have deconstructed Christianity deeply, but I have so many precious friends. And I honestly think your upbringing is going to be a lot more folks' experience in the future who lived a sort of interspiritual path. And I came
Mm.
at it the other way, but I remember the first time I read the Tao Te Ching, the first time I read Rumi, and I could just feel there's a passage in the Gospels where folks have encountered Jesus, but they don't know it's Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, and they say, "Shouldn't we have known because our hearts were strangely warmed when he spoke?" And that's what I
Oh,
felt when I read the Bhagavad Gita, Rumi, the Tao Te Ching, later the Ramayana. Is that warmth in my heart that there was something
mm.
there that felt familiar and called me to it.
I love that so much, Michael. That's
Yeah.
it. That resonance, that warmth.
Yeah. And I think it's a gift when we give ourselves permission to trust that.
Yes.
So last question about your sort of spiritual upbringing. And if I remember correctly, you ended up in Spain, and then you ended up falling in love with John of the Cross, which led you to translate John of the Cross.
Yes. That's
Was
it.
that's it? What remind me what got you to Spain?
Well, I was a junior in college, so I was
Hmm.
doing a semester abroad program. I was at that time, that was undergrad, I was majoring in anthropology and minoring in Spanish because I figured I had a good head start because I'd grown up going to Mexico a lot and I was pretty much fluent in Spanish, not completely, but street Spanish, I called it.
Yeah.
And so I thought it would be fun to go to Spain. It would be relatively easy to rack up some credits by studying
Mm,
Spanish literature in Spain. And that's where and I lived in Sevilla for 6 months, Seville.
mm,
And that's where I encountered the poetry of John of the Cross. And at that point, remember, I had come from Lama Foundation as a teenager, where I had been exposed to Sufism and really immersed in Rumi, in the teachings
mm.
of Jalaluddin Rumi, who at that time had not yet been translated into contemporary, kind of accessible American English. Robert Bly and
Mm,
Coleman Barks did that later for us. But at that time, I was just the only translations that were existing were rather stuffy British English
mm,
translations. But it didn't stop me from falling in love with Rumi because Rumi spoke the language of my heart, of
yeah.
longing, of fire, of gardens, of intoxication. So when I met John of the Cross in Spain, and for those of you who are not aware, he was a 16th century Carmelite monk. So I didn't meet him in person, but I definitely encountered him and became intimate with him and began reading his poetry in its original, early Renaissance language. I couldn't believe it. It sounded like he was copying Rumi. And then the more I dove into some of the early Jewish writings, I found that same fire of desire for God that just drenched the words of the early rabbis as well. So so yes, there was this resonance that became immediately
Mm,
apparent to me, especially between Rumi and John of the Cross. I'm pretty sure John of the Cross literally studied the poetry of Rumi because John of the Cross, when he was 16, was um was basically an orderly in a hospice,
mm,
and the hospital administrator, who was a priest, Carmelite priest, saw him and saw the way he was with patients and listened to the quality of his intelligence and his heart, and realized that he had great gifts and sent him to the University of Salamanca in northern Spain, which at the time was the center of learning throughout Europe, one of the major centers of learning. And part of the curriculum was studying as the Islamic scholars that had
mm.
come before, Ibn Arabi and many of the others, Avicenna. And so undoubtedly the young John of the Cross, the young Juanito, encountered these Islamic, really Sufi writings. And so I think he it wasn't just a kind of archetypal resonance. I think he was deeply influenced by the Sufi mystics who were deeply influenced by the Jewish mystics. Because remember,
Yeah.
Spain was was one unified field of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam for, I don't know,
Yeah.
close to 700 years under Islamic rule, I want to point out, which was
Sure.
incredibly tolerant and inclusive. So that was probably getting a little nerdy, sorry. But
No,
you
that's
were a
great. This
nerd,
is
fellow
I,
nerd.
I
So
am a fellow nerd. I like it, and I know that then a little later in your career, and I don't want to tell the story for you, but I love it, so I might. I remember you talking about sharing John of the Cross with students in English, and you said their eyes would glaze over when they would try to read him because the translations are what? So I've read some of these translations, so theological, so academic, so dry,
in
and
my
yeah,
opinion, I mean, some people you and I both love still pick those old
sure,
translations over mine, bless them.
yeah,
And I know why. They're deep and profound, and they were their first encounters with
yeah,
the power of these
yeah,
mystics. So I totally get it.
yeah.
But yes, so that's correct. At that point, I was teaching philosophy and world religions at the University of New Mexico in
Mm-hmm.
Taos. And I thought, I am going to share with them my favorite texts. Chief among them, Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross, because it was a life-changing text for me. First his poetry, and then later his prose treatises on the
Mm.
life of the soul. And I couldn't wait to like impart this jewel. And class after class, year after year, nothing. Radio silence from the hearts of my students. And so my friend Sean Murphy, who was a Zen teacher and was a creative writing teacher at UNM, said, why don't you do it? You speak Spanish, you love language, and
Yeah.
you adore this text. And it was a time when fresh contemporary translations of the mystics were starting to be a thing, mostly because of Rumi, actually, and the Sufi mystics. And so I was able to cast it out there, and it was picked up, and I haven't stopped since.
Oh,
Not
I
just
love it.
translating, but getting to hang out with the teachings of the mystics and do my best, yeah, to translate them. I no longer translate the original Spanish, or in the case of Julian of Norwich, Middle English, but I am translating the Dharma. I hope, translating the heart of these mystical teachings across the world's religions and wisdom traditions into
Yeah.
contemporary accessible English.
Well,
That's my
and it's
job.
such we could this is where we could really get lost in some nerdy sand traps here. So I'll just say this and move on. But I was talking to our mutual friend Carmen Acevedo Butcher recently about translation. And it dawned on me that we I don't want to say we a lot of folks maybe who will listen to this podcast live in cultural realities where being multilinguistic is not a part of their normal. So I think we've lost the internal technology or skill that once understood that translation is the work often of spirituality and relationship, right? Is like taking something from
Mm.
one time and one culture and one person's experience and then translating it into my lived experience and my understanding, but realizing that there's a give and take in the in between. Yeah. Did you think? I mean, does that feel right based on what you just said? It feels like translation might be the skill par excellence of the spiritual life.
I love that. I love the image. And I think what I heard when I listened to that just now is it requires deep listening,
Yeah.
listening to the other, listening to the culture,
Yeah.
listening to the child who's listening to you read a bedtime story.
Yeah. That's so good. Well, and I appreciate that because I think deep listening is what sparked our friendship. So to take it all the way back, you and I were at this retreat. I'm there with, I don't know, like I said, I think it was like 50 young influencers, something of the sort. We had that brief and wonderful exchange about that nerdy ass question. Everybody just got to hear a bit of what that sounded like. And then you were teaching, and I don't remember what the topic of your teaching was, but you said one thing that struck a chord in my heart pretty significantly. And I walked up to you at the end of the teaching and I said, "Can I ask you one more question?" And you said, "Yes." And I remember it going something like this. And we're going to unpack this a beat at a time because it was so good and it was really life-giving for me. I said, "Is there something about the call to the spiritual path that brings more loss into your life?" And you paused and you like tilted your head and you looked at me and you said, like almost confused. You said, "Do you know my work?" And I said, "No, but I want to." Um, and you asked me why. You gave me this much space to ask why I was asking the question. And I shared that, in my journey, I had lost one of my best friends in high school to a tragic accident, and then I had, lost several friends and several close people. Been through some difficult experiences with, my folks having a very public ministry that sort of blew up in a scandal. My brother's suicide, my mother's very painful and fast death to cancer, some other things, right? And you said, you paused and you said, "I want you to read my book, Caravan of No Despair." And then I'm gonna share what answer you gave me, but first, let's talk about the first thing you said, which was, "Do you know my work?" Because I know your work now, and I know you as a living translator of your experience into good teaching. But just in case anyone who's listening doesn't know, before we even get to your work, let's get to the wandering path that got you there. I've heard you say this is just one of those reincarnations, right? You have been no stranger to loss and difficulty in your life. I believe you lost a sibling when you were young.
That's right. Yeah, my brother
Um,
Matty died when he was 10 of a brain tumor,
hmm.
actually. And my mom and I was 8. So, yes, and then there were others.
And yes, lost a precious loved one. I think as a high school student,
Yeah, my first boyfriend. Yeah.
you've experienced the challenge to the degree that you're comfortable sharing. You don't have to. The challenges of where spiritual mentorship and guruship can go awry and be
Oh,
abusive.
yeah. Hmm.
Right? I'm assuming that's not an exaggeration to put it that way.
Yes, and it's not taboo either. I'm happy to
Yeah.
go there if there's
Well,
time.
yeah. I mean, if you would you give a 30-second flyover of that story if it's is it if it's not trite to ask for a short.
Oh, not at all. Just maybe it's good to talk about it because it so much of my loss has been in the form of the death of loved ones
Hmm.
that I it took me a long time to realize what a profound and traumatic loss the loss of my innocence was in
Hmm.
the hands and other body parts of a false guru,
Hmm.
who sexually abused me as a teenager in the name of contributing to my enlightenment,
Hmm.
which didn't happen.
Hmm.
I just kept not being enlightened, but meanwhile I was under the deepening control of this, egomaniacal, unwise, fake teacher. So, no, not just teacher, but really claimed to be a kind of messianic figure. So that was there were a lot of beliefs that came tumbling down and fell into that fire. And I, of course, ultimately see that as a great gift, but it sure didn't feel like it for many years.
I'll bet. And I mean to be so young, my experience of you now being friends with you for
Now that I'm
you
so old.
no, I mean being friends with you for half a decade, and I think about that story, and I know you as so passionate and so intelligent. So to have such a deep, committed desire for the divine that someone then tried to hijack for their own manipulative purposes. Goodness
Well
gracious.
said. Well said,
Yeah.
because that is exactly where it came from. I wanted God with every fiber of my being at 15, and he told me that he could give God to me
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people listening have probably had the experience of someone who promised to meet that holy desire and longing and passion and give God to them, and in fact harmed them, and for some folks probably made God feel further away than ever.
For sure. I definitely went on strike for years after that.
Hmm. Somehow found your way back, and just I know you well enough to know that there's no amount of stories that we could share that would cover the depth of how much you have been acquainted with loss in your life. But probably the story that I would imagine is the deepest hurt and the one that you're the most well known for is you translate John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul, a spiritual text about moving through seasons of seeming loss, difficulty, God being absent. And this is so interwoven with such a deep loss in the loss of your daughter, Jenny.
Yeah. Well, so some of you are familiar with this story, and I'll just encapsulate it. And for those of you who are not, you can explore it in my memoir that Mike mentioned, Caravan of No Despair. But the day that my first book came out, my first now of over a dozen books, but the very first one was a translation, as Michael mentioned, of Dark Night of the Soul, that text I love so much. And that day that it was published, Jenny, my daughter, my 14-year-old daughter, was killed in a car accident. And so those two events coincided in such a way that obviously changed and profoundly marked the course of the rest of
Hmm.
my life. It's really hard to just sum it up in a sentence or two, but there, that's my
Yeah.
my best effort.
Yeah, and I cannot recommend Caravan of No Despair enough. I Yeah, you recommended it to me at the end of 2019. I then went into massive life transition, which resulted in the fact that I got the chance to sit down and really, really read it deeply just as we were all settling into the pandemic in the beginning of 2020. Um, and it was such a powerful and a profound read for me.
Mm, thank you.
Really, yeah, thank you. Thank you. Life changing, I think.
So tell me more, tell us more. So there we were, and you were
Yeah.
asking about that the question about suffering, and
Yeah.
I very arrogantly, it sounds like to me from this perspective, asked if you
No.
were familiar with my work. And
Yeah.
and
This is
then
so
what?
great. This is one of my favorite moments. And so one, I'm glad that you asked me that question, are you familiar with my work? Because one of the things that we'll come back to this, I think, that really really has become real to me is that our wounds can lead us to our work in the world. Um and I want to get to that, but before I get to that, you said, "Do you know my work?" I said, "No, but I want to." And you said, "Read Caravan of No Despair." And then you said, "Well, here's my opinion." And you said, "My thought is that shit just happens." Now, my question was, is there something about the commitment to the spiritual path that brings more suffering into your life?
Right.
And you said, my opinion is shit just happens. There's not a cosmic target on your back. You are not being selected by the universe for suffering to turn you into some great spiritual teacher or something of the sort. I might be paraphrasing there, but you said something like that. And then you said, but suffering can and will supercharge your spiritual life if you let it. So
Yes.
let's unpack that one beat at a time. Um, I think you might have even said shit just happens, and you might have said something like you're not special. I think that might have been something you and I talked about later. And this is something that I really want to point out. You know, the medicine that can be healing for one person can be harmful for another. So the wrong person at the wrong time to be told they're not special, that could be really hurtful. For me, it was the medicine that I needed. I felt very seen in that moment because you intuitively picked up on the fact that it was something that I could hear and that I needed to hear because I had grown up, Mirabai, with everything from my deeply Christian friends who would say, just remember, it's all a part of God's plan. It's all for your good. All things work together for the good, which again, doesn't necessarily mean that all things are preordained to cause you harm to then result in good. But it's all part of God's plan. Or my very well-intended, just as passionate, just as spiritual friends of other spiritual orientations who would say, just remember, before you were born, you chose everything that would happen. You chose this. And I got to tell you, when my brother of 29 years old, who'd struggled with mental health issues for too long, put a gun to his head and left behind a pregnant wife and a grieving family and many grieving friends, it got a lot harder to swallow those words that it was all a part of God's plan.
Mm,
But I had prayed. Tell me if you relate to this one. I had prayed as a young child on my knees. God, I want to learn to love you. I want to learn what love is, and I want wisdom. Put me through anything you need to teach me that.
wow.
And then when that shit went down, it was really hard to reconcile, one, the notion that maybe I had asked for it, and two, the fact that it was really, really hard to believe that, any kind of divine order had caused this, much less the narcissism of going, well, this is for my benefit. And so
Mm,
you actually set me free when you said that. because I didn't realize how much I'd spent at that point a decade wrestling with that narrative. But all that to say, so that notion of shit just happens, the way I'm interpreting it, does that resonate? Do you encounter people who because they've been through a lot, there is this like, did you wonder about that? Is the universe heaping this upon me to teach me something? I'll stop talking. I want to
Hmm.
hear what you have to say.
Or the another version or variation of that is, did I choose the steep path this incarnation
Yeah.
to try to get there faster, wherever the
Yeah.
hell there is?
Yeah.
There was a there in my spiritual aspirations for a
Yeah.
very long time. There no longer is a
Yeah.
there I aspire to. But yeah, so I think that well, I write about this in Caravan. That I call it the curse of specialness.
Yeah.
So I suffered from this curse for all of my teens, 20s, 30s, and then Jenny died when I was 40,
Hmm.
40, 40. And that's when the curse lifted.
Hmm.
Because what I realized, not immediately, because at first I thought nobody else had ever lost a child or could ever possibly understand what I was going through, but that quickly gave way to a deep soul sense of connectedness
Hmm.
to everybody who'd ever lost a child or ever would,
Hmm.
or were right now experiencing
Hmm.
what I'm experiencing. It was visceral, this feeling of interconnection with all bereaved beings.
Hmm.
And I never again have returned to a space of feeling like I'm either specially marked for suffering or that I have some kind of special insight into the
Hmm.
human condition or anything that exalts my grief and loss as evidence of my sanctity.
Hmm.
I do, however, feel that grief and loss can exalt us in the sense that
Yeah.
there's a dignity, a nobility, even in the authenticity of the grieving heart, if we allow ourselves to stay with it, to be with it. And that's one of the reasons I think I spend so much time as a grief guide, as someone who holds space for grieving people, because selfishly, I am drawn to the radical authenticity and beauty and often humor, sense of humor.
Yeah.
It's gallows humor, but that
Yeah.
kind of just the no bullshit purity of the broken heart.
Yeah. I so appreciate that. It's such an interesting it's funny. I think about the last 6 years of my life. I'm 48. I've been on this path for a minute. But how my orientation to this has shifted even since you and I had that conversation. I Yeah, just please forgive me to throw some random free associations, but you're used to how I talk, so
I love it.
oh yeah, there's this sort of Thomas Keating used to say, there's two spiritual paths. There's the long, slow path of discipline, or there's the fast path of radical suffering to create spiritual transformation. And our mutual friend Richard Rohr has added that the path of great love also is another shortcut. I would say the more joyful one. And that's all well and good, and it's great for those of us who have suffered. But it's akin to saying, like, you can take the long trail down the mountain, or you can just have someone push you off the cliff. The cliff is faster, and it is, but it's not better. Like, it's not more fun, right? And yet, or I think of Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, one of my all-time favorite books. And he says
Mhm.
the last freedom to us is to decide our attitude in any circumstance and to find meaning. But me thinking that the universe had caused something to happen to me because there was some divine pattern or some mythic hero journey that I was finding myself on, and I needed to uncover the secret meaning and all the loss, as opposed to just going, no, this shit happened, but I can make meaning out of it. Like, that's an option available to me now. it sounds almost like a subtle semantic difference, but it could not be more different in my lived experience.
Exactly. And what you said, I said, and I don't remember it, but could well be,
Yeah.
um, that so this stuff happens and but it can, if we show up for it, I think you said supercharge our spiritual
Yeah.
lives. And that is exactly what I think. Like Frankel, I do believe that it's what we do with what happens, the
Mm.
meaning that we make of our tragedies, of our pain, of our suffering, that matters most. And I would take that into the realm of what we're talking about, that not just making meaning, that that's beautiful and it
Mm-hmm.
matters so much, but actually ignite our spiritual heart
Yeah.
and and um, grant us access to a deeper intimacy with the divine. And that
Yeah.
intimacy comes out of the nakedness that loss, um,
Mm.
I don't know, loss strips us.
Yeah.
And that naked soul that's left has e easier access. I don't know. There is an intimacy that is possible. I wouldn't have designed it that way myself, but
Yeah.
as long as we're naked with the beloved, let's do this.
Yeah. There's a conversation that'll come up in some of these conversations I've recorded for the podcast with old mentor of mine, Dennis Patrick Slattery. He was my dissertation chair.
I know who he is. Yes.
Yeah, he's great. And I asked him, I said that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Why do you think that is? How do you think that works? And he said, and I think about this with our friendship and our connection, how grateful I am to have you as a teacher. He said, very often the teacher appears when the student has suffered a very serious blow to their ego.
Mm,
And as a result, they're open to new possibilities and they can receive the teaching.
mm,
And I had never considered that before, but wow, does it seem true?
mm,
Like the wisdom that comes of our wounds seems like you said, that nakedness, that raw vulnerability. Shit, when stuff hasn't worked, you're open to something new. And yet there's also something there that there's a unquantifiable something that I can't define that lets some folks be open to meaning and new possibilities in the midst of loss. Do you have any sense of what that is, or do you think it's the inheritance of everyone? It just takes the appropriate amount of time.
yeah, I do think it's our birthright.
Mm.
Meaning making is
Mm.
is um woven into the tapestry of the human
Mm.
soul. And not everybody does it. I've
Yeah.
certainly sat with a lot of bereaved people who, when I speak about something like, using poetic language, because it's the only language that makes sense to me in many moments, like the fragrance of the sacred is
Mm.
rising from the embers of your loss. They're like, what are you talking about?
That
They don't get it and they never will.
makes so much
And
sense to me.
exactly. And I'm like, you don't get that? It just surprises
Yeah.
me. But of course not everybody's going to speak that kind of soul language,
Mm.
and that's totally fine. But many of us do and will, and those are the people that I think I'm meant to hang out with. I mean, even the Buddha
Yeah.
said, when he was challenged by Mara, the Lord of Death, in his kind of we're recording this on Good Friday, by the way,
Yeah.
y'all. And so, Jesus, the Jesus story is very much in my heart today. And I think about his time in the desert after his baptism and wrangling, with the forces that wanted to take him down, that wanted to
Mm.
convince him that his what he was here to do was futile. And the Buddha had Siddhartha Gautama had the same kind of experience in his desert. of enlightenment, because we all on the awakening journey have to go through these desert periods, right? And one of the questions that Mara asked him, the Lord of Death asked him, is, okay, so maybe you are meant to bring this dharma, this teaching to the world, but no one's gonna believe you. Who cares? Yeah.
Yeah.
What are you thinking, Michael?
No, I'm before you deliver the punchline, I have to tell you this is one of my all-time favorite stories, and
Mm.
it's kept me on the path of my work for, I want to say, oh my god, 28 years since I first heard it. So yeah, you
No,
end the
so
story. It's
you take it
well,
from here.
so if I know the story, tell me how you know it differently. But it's essentially that. Like, what's the point? No one's going to understand anyway. And I think the
Yeah.
way the story was told to me was the Buddha touched two fingers to the ground to let the earth testify on his behalf and said, "There will be some who understand."
That's
Right?
exactly right. And the part that people often leave out is the touching his fingers to the earth. The earth will bear me witness.
Yeah.
And the earth, she does, man, she does bear witness
Yeah.
to it,
Good
because
God.
the truth is embodied.
Yeah.
That's why the Mother Earth herself is going to bless you. You're stepping up and speaking your truth, because it's not some abstract, disembodied, transcendent
Yeah.
philosophy you're meant to dispense to the world. It's lived experience. And yes,
Yeah.
there will be some who will get it. And that sounds more
Yeah.
elitist than I mean for it to be. Like when you keep speaking about me as a teacher, I mean, whatever. I am a seeker on this path,
Yeah.
just like you, and I'm older, and I've been at it a long time, and I've written a bunch of books, and I never for a minute mistake myself for someone who has this all figured out.
Yeah.
And people like you, Michael, are continuously filling my cup
Mm.
with new
Yep.
insight and new understanding and wonderment. So I am a perpetual student, and I am at your feet too.
Well, I appreciate that, and I said it at the top, and I'll say it again. Like I think one of the things that I've always loved about you as a teacher, as a friend. I think when you signed that first copy of Caravan of No Despair, you referred to me as little brother, and I've so appreciated deepening into that relationship. I think I take you so seriously because you're so devoid of self seriousness. And that's such a gift. So many spiritual systems praise humility, and we've in the English language at least we've turned humility, which means we say it's to be low, and so we turn it as to being pushed down or to falling on the ground. And in reality, it comes from the word humus, right, which is earth, and it just ground. Being
Yes.
humble is just being grounded.
Mm.
And my God, being grounded in the real world. And I've so appreciated you that way, and our friendship that way, and also the literalness of it. In one of the things that I appreciate sharing with you is a love for nature,
Yes.
and recognizing that that's also the great teacher that sustains us sometimes when nothing else does.
Mm. Well, I can't wait till the next time we get to hang out together and go
Yeah.
walking in the foothills of the Sangre de Cristos here
Oh
in
my gosh.
Taos.
Well, I want to ask you. I don't want to be abusive of your time here, but I do want to ask you two more questions, and they're big questions,
Oh,
if you're good for it.
okay.
So one of the ideas that I'm wondering about is this. Is it possible that our wounds set us out on our wandering? And it's not just our wounds; our wonder as well sets us on these things. Our deep love of the divine and beauty, and but our wounds set us on our wandering. They shape our path. They give us our wondering, the questions that we ask. They help us find our wise guides and our wisdom. And then they lead us to our work, and that we put our healing in the service of healing others, right? We find it, and then we turn around and we pass it on. Really, it's been your teaching. Well, now I have three questions. Sorry. All right, let's you and I just unpacked it. Here we go. I'll do one of three. In the work that I've seen you do in the time that we've known each other and you've done up to that point, you have done and are doing such rich work right now on grief as a spiritual path. What is the very short introduction to what you've learned about that, which we can also offer as an opportunity for folks to go deeper with the programs you're running and the books you have coming and already exist? But if you were to give the elevator pitch of how is grief a spiritual path for us and not just, clean up after a mess?
Mm, right. So my Wild Heart community is called Holy Lament, and it's a circle of people who are doing exactly that. They are saying these terrible things have happened in my life. I've experienced great loss and deep sorrow, and there's something in my soul that says, this is a fiery gate that is inviting me to step through into a sacred landscape. I
Mm.
know it, I feel it, I want it. Um, People aren't talking about it in the dominant culture. You're only allowed one flavor of grief, and that is sadness. And then you should get over that as quickly as possible and get on with your life. Rather than there is a deep invitation here, I can feel it in my bones that, yeah, I mean, Frankl would call it meaning making. I would call it transformation. And it's beckoning. It's beckoning not despite, but from the very flames of, from the heart of my experience of great suffering. And so lo and behold, there are gazillions of people that are responding to that invitation.
Mm.
And if grief is a spiritual path for my community, writing is our primary spiritual practice. I mean, there are lots of rituals and things we could do and do,
Mm-hmm.
but actually writing becomes a form of prayer, of contemplative, of contemplation,
Mm.
of knowing of our true hearts and in community because we share our writing a lot, so it's a very simple space of being real about what we feel and sharing it with each other, and it just breaks us open to this, yeah, supercharged spiritual space. I can't describe it any other way.
I'm so excited about the work that you're doing, and I benefit so much from it. Obviously, as
Thank you.
as grief is a huge part of my spiritual path, and I, yeah, like the evolution from grief as an impediment to the path to, grief is something that could supercharge my path. Grief is the path has been
Yes.
such a rich and healing balm in my life, just to know that
Mm,
there's an invitation to depth in that, and that the very things that feel like they're taking me away from love, the divine, the people around me, my own soul, actually might take me deeper in, and that I can
yeah.
trust the difficulty. It's so, so good. I'm so grateful. Um,
Michael, when I had the kind of vision to do this work, this Holy Lament community, I was like, oh shit, I don't want to spend the rest of my life talking about my dead daughter
yeah,
and grief and loss. And please, can I, yeah, you get
yeah,
it, right?
yeah,
Take this cup from me. Let
yeah,
me do something else, something more
yeah,
fun.
yeah,
But I have to say that by my saying yes to my soul's invitation to do this work, tremendous joy has come flowing into my life.
yeah,
Being with these people is such a privilege and actually, dare I say, fun. We have a lot of
yeah,
fun.
yeah,
There is a release of um I don't know, a release of the oppression of the spiritual traditions that tell us that we should transcend our feelings, and when we let
yeah,
that go, it's like a release of energy. That's what I'm trying to say.
yeah.
That's really quite joyous.
That's so good. I'll say this, and then I have two nerdy ass questions. We'll button it up. Mirabai, when I worked with a spiritual director for 13 years. It's one of those people I wish I could drag California and New Mexico closer together, because I'd love to just see the two of you have a conversation. Um, the very first time I went to see her, it was a year after my mom's death, and a year and a half after my brother's death. And so she said, I'd never done spiritual direction before. She said, "Why are you here?" And I said, I'm studying all these different religions, and I want to figure out how to put them together and speak the language of Jungian psychology and all this stuff. And she let me talk for an hour, and then she said, "That's not why you're really here." And I said,
Wow.
okay, oh, great wise one, you tell me, why am I really here? And she said, you just want to know why you've had so much loss in your life. And before I could get any words out, I started to cry. So I knew she
Mm.
was telling me the truth. And before I could think, I said, do you ever come back from this? And she said, in my experience, yes. She said, the people that I know that have suffered great loss and stayed with it have become some of the healthiest, most whole, and most joyful people I've ever met. She said, here's
Mm.
the thing. She said, loss carves out a giant open space in your heart. And she said, that space can contain not only your sorrow, but the sorrow of the world and other people. She's like, you're going to be quick to tears for the rest of your life. True. And she said, the other thing is it also can hold a lot of love and a lot of joy. So she said, you'll probably also be quick to laughter for the rest of your life. She said,
Mm.
most of the people I know who've suffered loss and stayed with it, they're some of the funniest people I know. They're some of the most joyful people I know. But the courage to trust that big empty space and that it might actually be the expanding of our hearts, that's a scary thing to step into.
So beautiful, Michael. So beautiful.
Oh my gosh. Well, I want to say so the whole podcast here, the whole idea started with I grew, I'm Jungian, whatever. We're trained in Joseph Campbell and this idea of the hero myth and the idea that there's a pattern of life that you can see in all the great spiritual teachers and that we live ourselves, and there's a call to adventure, and then there's a quest that we all go on, and we do the work that is ours to do, and we slay the dragons that is ours to slay, and we find some friends and we find some allies. And then if we're lucky, we find some boon or something. And then we go back home and we might have a gift to share with the culture around us. And then the story ends.
Hmm.
And I stopped looking at the hero pattern recently and I decided to go further back and look at the shamanistic pattern, which is a lot older, right? Mircea took the word shaman from these Siberian folk healers, but he realized there were patterns in the way that these healers operated that you can find all over the world on every continent and real old. And it was usually folks that suffered some kind of illness or dismemberment very early in life that they survived that marked them as a healer, and then they would become a healer for the local community. But the idea was they healed, and then they put that healing in the service of healing the people around them.
Yeah.
So, like, you doing your heroic healing was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the story. And
Mm.
I realized, tell me if this makes sense, I think it was your work on the women mystics that turned me on to that being the actual pattern that's more life
Mm.
giving and relevant right now than the hero pattern where I go out and find myself and then the work is done. Because tell me, does that feel true? It seems like the women
Mhm.
mystics themselves follow more of that shamanic pattern. They suffer what is theirs to suffer, and then they find the medicine, and then they turn around and spend their lives giving the medicine. Does that
Oh,
feel right?
totally, totally right, Michael. So thank you for making that connection, for building that bridge. And so in my book, Wild Mercy, which is the probably what you're referring to in my work with the women mystics, the subtitle of Wild Mercy is Living the Fierce and Tender Wisdom of the Women Mystics. And I was looking at women across the spiritual traditions who are powerful exemplars of the awakened heart, really. And they're all, they all fit that pattern you
Hmm.
just described. Near death experiences, severe illnesses, loss of children, of spouses, of betrayals by their communities, sometimes all of the above. And they suffered consciously and passionately in many cases. And yes, emerged not in some kind of dramatic enlightenment story like we are often given versions of it by the male saints and mystics, but just a slow, embodied, messy, beautiful butterfly transformation.
Hmm.
And their task became to bring that nectar, the nectar of joy,
Hmm.
of love, of passion, of desire, of peace and equanimity, all of it to community. And knowing that we only wake up in community, that no one is free until we're all free.
It's so beautiful, and it's so daunting and also empowering to consider that our healing is not just for us alone, right?
And people do get daunted by that. We get overwhelmed, like, what is mine to do? I can't figure it out. And how could I possibly do anything in the face of such suffering in the world and such chaos right now in our political culture? You know, what can I possibly bring? And I think that this conversation with you has given us some clues that what is ours to do is intimately entwined with what we've experienced in an embodied way, and that it isn't supposed to hurt to be of
Mm,
service in this world, that there is joy in bringing our gifts, and that our gifts are the evidence of our gifts are probably is in the feeling of expansion we have when we're doing our thing. Like for me, it turned out to be writing. I love writing. I
yeah.
love language. I love weaving those words on those pages. And sure enough, that turned out to be what is my prophetic calling in a way, you know, my response to the prophetic call. And I think for all of you listening, you know what you love to do. You know what you're good at. I can promise you the clue as to what is yours to do right now in the midst of what might seem absolutely overwhelming is right there in what you love to do and what makes your heart sing and what you do well.
So it's not cheating to love the work and to
That's
feel passionate.
right.
All right, I appreciate that.
You'll
I'll say,
burn out otherwise.
I one of my favorite stories about you. This 2 or 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I'd been a really intense season of work, and I was a flickering wick, close to burnout. And one of the joys of working for the Center for Action and Contemplation is they let us take a retreat every year. So I was going out into the desert with a week alone to just read some books and hike some of my favorite hikes. And a very well meaning friend had said to me, you really need to make this a spiritual retreat and make it as hard as you possibly can. Don't have a fire. Don't take pictures. Don't read things you're going to enjoy. Don't bring food that tastes good. You really want to make it a spiritual, ascetical practice. And I checked in with you, and you were like, don't do that, that's patriarchy. You were like, absolutely not. I think you said it in stronger language, actually. It was great. It was like you're like, absolutely no. And you were like, Michael, you work hard enough. Like, this retreat for you needs to be falling into the arms of the Divine Mother. And I was like, okay, so bring wine and chocolate. And you were like, yes, please. And it was so what I needed. And then what was funny was, months later, that same friend came to me and said, I realized something. He said, our spiritual paths are different. And he'd had a very healthy childhood and struggled with ego issues and stuff, and said, my path is to realize that I'm not worthy, but your path is to realize that you are worthy and that you are
Mm.
loved. And it occurred to me that, again, what is medicine for one person might be harm for another. Our dear friend Richard Rohr talks about praying for one humiliation a day to keep him humble.
Mm.
And I
Mm.
always joke with him and say, I need one moment of humor a day. I don't have the ego strength for one humiliation a day. So closing question, how do we navigate that spiritual path to recognize what is the healing medicine for one person might not be a fit for another?
Deep listening.
Hmm.
Deep listening. And when you're, a writer like I am and like you are, you can't always do that. You
Yeah.
fling your words out into the world and hope that they will land on the hearts that would benefit
Hmm.
from them. Um, and then you have to just trust that it's not going to be for everybody. And on a regular basis, I get scathing emails and other messages from people who are like, "Yeah, you too." Like, how could you dare to suggest such and such? Like, that there is some kind of pattern for grief and loss and transformation, that it's as if it were linear. It's like, I have given that disclaimer in 11 other places. You just happened to hear me say something in this moment that sounded like that to your ears. But,
Yeah.
so I have to do a lot of letting go of other people's opinions on the things that I say and don't
Mm.
say because I can't please them all. But there is um, a trust that I have in my heart that I'm speaking with integrity and with love and with a genuine desire for the well-being of
Mm.
the people that encounter my work. And I have to let it go there.
Yeah.
That's all I can do.
Oh gosh, I so appreciate that, and we'll end this where we started, which is I so appreciate the encouragement to trust that our wounds will lead us to our unique wisdom, or even our own wondering and wandering, our own questions to wrestle with, and the work that we do internally before we put our work out into the world, and to help us all find our voice. I'm so grateful for you. I'm so glad. I love you so much. I learned so much from you, and I have so much joy. And I'm so grateful that I showed up at that retreat and asked you that nerdy ass question.
I am grateful too, Michael. You're one of the most cherished people in my life now. I would never have known from that first moment. Well, I might have had a glimpse, like, oh yeah, he's one of my heart people. But
Mm.
the deepening of our friendship is truly a precious gift in my life. So thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to everyone listening, and thank you, Mirabai, for the wisdom that you shared with all of us as we continue to explore what it means to walk the path of the healer. Friends, thanks for listening. If you haven't figured out by now, my name's Dr. Mike Petro. I'm the host of The Healer with a Thousand Faces. I am a seminary dropout who instead pivoted to do my studies in comparative religions, comparative mythology, and Jungian depth psychology. I'm a certified spiritual director, grief and trauma counselor. I've been a mental health worker, a theater chaplain, and an owner of the world's most amazing cat named Albus Dumbledore. I am so grateful that the best teachings that I've experienced in my life have been the lives and the deaths of so many good friends and wise guides, and I am so excited to share them with you in the coming episodes. Got a lot more coming. Till next time, I encourage you to ask the question, how have your wounds led you out on your unique wanderings? What wonderings have they given you? What questions are yours to ask and answer? What wisdom have they revealed? And what work is that leading you to today as you put your own healing in the service of healing the world? Thanks a bunch. We'll see you next time.